rolling. Okay. My name is Elizabeth Faeder. Today is the 12th? 13th. Today is June 13th, 2018. I'm here today with Jessica Schneider, the archivist for Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and with Mr. Stephen Shore. Could you go ahead and please give me your full name?
Stephen Michael Shore.
Okay. And can you tell me where you're from and the name of your parents? And
Originally from Pittsburgh, and my parents were Abraham Shore and Gladys Stern Shore.
And you from Pittsburgh. When did you move here to Dallas?
In 1980, but had a lot of stops in between.
Fantastic. How did you go from Pittsburgh to Dallas?
From Pittsburgh to Rochester to Washington, D.C., Dayton, Ohio, back to Pittsburgh, Wappingers Falls, New York, Rochester, New York, Tucson, Phoenix, New York City, Houston, San Diego, back to New York, and then here. And I think I missed Wappingers Falls in there, New York.
Where did you go to school?
At Rochester Institute of Technology.
And what did you major in?
Photographic, or imaging sciences, it's now called.
I'm just going to pause right here. I'm so sorry. I just realized his nose room is wrong. I should be over there. Because if the nose room is over there, I should be over there. I'm just
Okay, that's not a problem.
The film student came out.
We'll just mirror the image, that's okay.
What made you get into photography? So did you find photography interesting at a young age?
Yes. When I was 8 or 9, I was reading a copy of Boys Life magazine, and they used to have these ads in the back where if you sold greeting cards, you could choose a prize. So I sold a couple cases of greeting cards and chose a camera as a prize. And then for my bar mitzvah, one of my uncles gave me a better camera, and that really got me involved. And then it just got crazy from there.
Did you tell me the name of your parents already? I apologize.
Yes, Abraham Shore and Gladys Rhea Stern Shore.
What did you go to any religious school while you were growing up in Pittsburgh?
Oh yes. Well, we belonged to a conservative synagogue, B'nai Israel, and went to Hebrew school for 4 years and Sunday school for 8 or 9 years.
What do you remember? What do you remember about? Did you have any particular interest in photography with the synagogue? Did you ever collaborate with them in regards to this?
I don't think I did. No, by the time I was involved in photography, I was going to synagogue as infrequently as possible.
So you went to MIT and you made...
No, RIT.
RIT, I apologize.
That's okay.
Why did you want to particularly go into that field in regards to that?
Well, when I was in high school, I thought I wanted to be a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And for one of our classes, we were given an assignment to do a 3-page paper on a vocation in which we were interested in. And I did mine on photography. And by the time I finished the paper, I didn't want to be a photographer. Well, they work long hours, they work weekends, they work nights, they work alone, they work in dark rooms a lot, and they don't make a lot of money. And none of this made a whole lot of sense to me. But I found out there was a program in photographic engineering that at the time was called Photographic Science and Instrumentation at Rochester Institute of Technology. And since I'd always been strong in math and science, it sounded like a good idea to me, and I did it, and I worked in that field for about a decade.
What was your first job outside of college?
After college?
After, what was your first major photography career?
Well, I was working for a company called Data Corporation, and the company had a contracts with both the Air Force and NASA to do precision photographic processing. So all the film that came back from the Apollo program was processed at our site and prints made there. What I was doing there was actually doing sensitimetric characterization of the film that was supposed to be used on the lunar surface. Oh, it got more interesting in later jobs.
Then what year? My apologize. What year were you moved? What year did you move into Dallas? I probably said that already.
1980.
1980, and then what was your first position here, job career-wise?
Well, I moved down with a company I was working with.
Okay.
And by that time, I had moved into publishing, and I was with a publishing company, CMP Publishing, and was their district sales director for this area. This area being 22 states.
But now you're with you work with these.
I'm with my own company,
You're with your own company, but you
but I do lots of volunteer work.
Yeah, so why? Yeah, can you tell me about your volunteer work and tell me about the different organizations you work with? Because I've seen that and I think it's just remarkable. I want to know, just why you go down those particular volunteer programs and why, how you bring photography into it, how you implement it into the whole entire volunteer work.
Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't.
Yeah.
When my son was about to be bar mitzvahed, we, as a family mitzvah project, worked with the Temple Emmanuel Brotherhood. Once a month, they do a mitzvah cooking project where they make about 2,500 to 3,000 meals on a Sunday morning once a month. And after I was doing this for about 6 months, one of the guys said, "Why don't you come to one of our meetings?" I was like, well, he said, "It's tomorrow night, just come by." By the time that meeting was over, I was a publicity secretary for the organization and started getting more and more involved in more projects. And the publicity secretary is actually one of the busier positions there because you're involved in absolutely everything that happens. And so I was doing promotion for everything in newsletters, and it was a little crazy. And then got involved in some very specific projects, like one part, Dr. Richard Wasserman and I started Party Expo, and it was a once-a-year gathering of vendors that provide services for people doing bar and bat mitzvahs, weddings, anniversaries, whatever kind of party. And we would fill Toby an auditorium, which we could put 54 booths in there, and a couple of times we actually filled the entire auditorium. And we'd have about 400 people show up to, they were about to have bar and bat mitzvahs and weddings to look to see what was available, and some of them even signed contracts during that. We had the pajama party once where the entry fee was a set of pajamas per person, and it was for the kids. And then the pajamas were given to Child Protective Services for the city. One of the things I started one of the other things I'm involved in is scouting. And at the 2010 Boy Scout Jamboree, the National Jewish Committee on Scouting ran a chauffeur factory for the Scouts, which I thought was great. And where they gave them a raw horn at the end of the session. They ended up with a chauffeur and how to blow it, and knew how to blow it. It was great. So we started doing this at Emmanuel, and I pushed for this. And end of August, we'll be doing our 8th annual chauffeur factory. Yeah, and it's great. We do it with 5th graders every year, and it's great watching them coming in, not quite knowing what's going to happen, and at the end leaving with their own chauffeurs and all excited about it.
That's so cool. So you have how many children? Can you tell me the name of your children? I'm sorry. You had
2, Sam and Tessa.
And so son and a daughter.
Yes.
How just going here for general wise, I mean, you said you grew up in a rather conservative Jewish family. Did you feel like?
Well, I don't know that we were all that conservative. We
Yeah.
belonged to a conservative congregation.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things we did were conservative, but we didn't think of it as being religious. It was just the way we were.
Yeah.
The first time I ever saw a glass of milk on the table with a piece of meat at the same time, I was a sophomore in college. And I saw it, and I just got ill looking at it. It looked just so strange.
So do you belong to a synagogue here in Dallas right now?
Temple Emmanuel.
Emmanuel. How long have you been with them?
About 25, 26 years.
And you've done volunteer work with them and like helped them for
In various things.
various.
The first time I did any work with them, my son must have been about 7 or 8, but they were looking for 2 people to run the end of year picnic/party they have for the last day of Sunday school. So they corralled me into doing that with another woman, and we ran that, and that went well. And then somehow I ended up on the religious school board, the religious school committee, and tried to do as little as possible with all that. But then once I got involved with Brotherhood, I seemed to get involved in everything. And at one point, I both sat on the board and sat on the executive committee at Emmanuel.
Tell me about the Brotherhood, the full name of the Brother. I've done a lot of research on that, and I feel like this is a really, really, really cool organization. So go to the
Well, Temple Emmanuel Brotherhood's been around since 1922. And like all organizations of its ilk, our membership has been going down over the years, which is true for almost any kind of organization like this, regardless of what their religious or non-religious basis is. But we've had as many as 650 members. Right now we have a couple hundred members. And it was set up to be both a social services or a social support organization and to do social things. We don't do that much social, but we've tended to do a lot of things to help the temple and the community. We usually run 3 or 4 community breakfasts a year where we will serve Lux and bagels and then have a panel of speakers. And the panels have been all over the place. We had a rabbi who was the chief rabbi for Asia for a number of years speak with us one time. When it was announced that Pete Sessions and Martin, I forget his name, the other representative that ended up running against one another, when we had them lined up to speak, and the Tuesday before they were going to speak, it was announced they were going to be actually running against one another. So that was great. We did one on the Trinity River Project. We had 385 people show up to hear that. No one knew what the Trinity River Project was. We've done them on religious topics, on health topics, on political topics, you name it, just a whole selection of things. I mentioned the Party Expo. We provide scholarships for summer camp for kids. We provide maintenance for toys and playthings for the playgrounds. We've been the charter organization for Troop 729. It was founded in 1918 or 1919, so 3 or 4 years before the Brotherhood was founded. And then when the Brotherhood was founded, one of its first things was to become the charter organization.
Troop 729, that is a Boy Scouts group?
It was. It folded about a year ago.
Okay. And Troop 7, did that have mainly Jewish gentlemen in that, or was it just some Boy Scouts group?
It was a Jewish troop, but anybody could join.
Okay, of course.
And the percentage of Jewish scouts in it would go up and down. Usually there were at least 50% Jewish kids, but not always.
What ages was it from? Like from 7 to?
Well, Boy Scouts is 11 until they hit their 18th birthday.
Okay. I see.
Cub Scouts is from
okay.
7 to 11.
Now you're ringing a bell. Were your children in that, or were you
my son was in Boy Scouts, but not in that troop.
Okay.
Because he started with Cub Scouts, and he started with a Cub Scout pack that was chartered by the school he was going to, by Green Hill. So that when he bridged from Cub Scouts to Boy Scouts, he just went to the Boy Scout troop that was at Green Hill.
Going a little bit backward, and I thought about going all over the place here. When you were growing up, you said you found inspiration with photography in a postcard contest, correct? It was in the back of a magazine. You talked about that.
Right, by selling greeting cards.
As time went by, did you ever think any events in the world kind of affected your love for photography more, before you went into college, that you knew that you wanted to go somewhere in the photography field, whether it be
I don't know that there was any one event. It's like if you ask a poet when they decide they were going to be a poet, or a painter when they're going to be a painter. It's usually over a series of time. Finally, you realize this is what I do.
How is the world different today, in regards to your field and in regards to your, just the Jewish community as it was when you were growing up?
Well, those are two very different questions.
Sorry.
Jewish community is, for me, is substantially different here than what I grew up in. Growing up in Pittsburgh, the area I grew up in Pittsburgh, it was in the east end of Pittsburgh, and most of the east end was very heavily Jewish. There were a number of synagogues. Some were large, some were little house synagogues. The area I lived in was actually called Stanton Heights. It was sort of a hill above the rest of the east end. And it was an interesting community because it was, if you looked at households, it was about half Jewish, half non-Jewish. But it seemed like all the Jewish families moved in just post-World War II. So all of the kids were the same age. I went to an elementary school that had 800 kids in it, and on the Jewish high holidays, there'd be 8 kids there because everybody else was Jewish. But if you, again, you looked at my street, and there were lots of non-Jewish families, so it was kind of interesting. But because so many of the kids and the families with kids that age were Jewish, it was like growing up in a completely Jewish community. And so, when I mentioned not seeing milk and meat on the table, we never really thought about keeping kosher. It was just, you didn't eat meat and milk together, and we didn't eat. Eventually, we started eating pork, but for years we didn't eat pork. I mean, I remember the decision. I remember the decision my parents had when they decided to start buying non-kosher meat. I mean, these were things that we just did. But because the community had Reform, Orthodox, and conservative families, we did know the difference. And so we knew when someone was Orthodox versus conservative because they just had slightly different traditions that they followed. But it was all the same. It was very funny at elementary school in 5th and 6th grade. You'd get out at 3:30 and 2 days a week. In the parking lot was a yellow school bus. You got in the yellow school bus and it took you to Hebrew lessons. And nobody ever thought of complaining about it because everybody did it. We only complained about it when we were there.
What accomplishment, can you say, are you the most proud of, ever, overall of your career? I know there are a lot, but you've done so much. What do you think is your proudest accomplishment, biggest accomplishment?
I don't think of life that way. I think of life as what accomplishments I'm going to do, not what I've done. So I'm proud of lots of things that I've done, but there's no one accomplishment. It's like I had one job where we had moved floors 5 years before, and I had a new secretary. And one day, as I was leaving to go on a trip, she said, "What are those 2 boxes in the corner of your office?" I said, "I have no idea, but they've been there for years." I said, "Well, I'm gone, just throw them out." She said, "Should I look at what's in them?" I said, "No, just throw them out. If I haven't needed them." I came back to my office a week later, and there on the wall was a wall full of sales awards. Well, I mean, it was sort of funny to see them up there, but who cares? That was in the past. That's what happened years ago. That's not what I'm going to do.
Really good,
Yeah, I never would have put them up myself.
No, I think that's a really, really good way to look at life and look at future endeavors. What's the one thing you want people to remember, just about the Jewish community and about certain organizations here in the Jewish community? Because like you said, there are a Jewish troop folded a year or so ago.
But we do have other Jewish units.
Exactly. But what
Yes.
do you want people to remember about that? Because I mean, there are so many organizations here that need to be recognized for all they do. So what do you think is the most important for people to remember about that overall?
I see Judaism as being an integral part of what we do, of who we are. But who we are we're like a jigsaw puzzle. We're lots of things. And to work well, you've got to get all the pieces. And I'm very involved in scouting because I find that scouting brings things to our lives that other things don't. That's not to say we shouldn't be doing the other ones, but we don't always have champions for all. We have champions for all the other ones. We don't always have champions for scouting. And most people, when they think of scouting, think it's about something with hiking and camping. And that's like saying that music is about cassette tapes because you play with cassette tapes. Well, that's just the tool. And it's the same thing with scouting. Scouting is about giving young people leadership skills they can use for the rest of their lives. And the activities done in scouting are all to build on those leadership capabilities that the kids will develop. So, yeah, hiking is nice, but it's even better when you put some kid in charge of the hike so that he has to remember that somebody has to be assigned to bring lunch, and somebody has to assign to, there's 6 of them, so they need 3 tents, and putting things together and knowing how to handle life's problems. And when things come up that are problems, knowing they can handle them and either handle them themselves or assign them out to someone else. And it's not the kind of training we get in school. It's not the kind of training we get in religious school or at the synagogue or temple. And so I see it being very complementary and something that I think we all need. In fact, I'm very pleased that BSA now will have women in scouting, girls in scouting, because I think women need the same tools that men do.
That's fantastic. That's really great. I guess this is kind of leads me to the next question, which you probably already answered, but I'm going to have you reiterate one more time. I feel like it's such a good message. What advice would you like to leave for the next generation?
I'm sorry, what?
What advice?
Advice?
Yeah. I mean, you said you started you have your own company now. You've you've done a lot of things in regards, and that's great. I mean, what advice would you give to future generations in regards to if they have a love for photography, if they want to help our organizations, what advice would you give them?
I was actually having a discussion that relates to this last night at a meeting. And I was talking with someone about he was talking with someone from another country. And he asked the guy how he was. And the guy is going into this long explanation of how he was. Because in the US, when you say, how are you? Somebody answers, and to be honest, we don't really listen. We don't really care how they feel. But in this person's country, if you're asked that question, you give a complete and honest answer because you think the person really wants to know. And so I was discussing my changes in attitude about that, basically that question. And in high school, I realized that people really don't give a damn on how you feel. And so, and how you answer typically doesn't make any difference. And if you're complaining, they turn it off very quickly. So if somebody asks me how I am, the worst answer I'll ever give is good. But usually it's great, spectacular, amazing, always very up. And the reason I discussed it with this guy is because what I realized was that because my response was always very positive, my attitude became positive. If I kept saying I'm good, I must be good. And I convinced myself. And consequently, I tend to have a very up attitude. And in fact, I just analyzed this very recently and decided that I've had an up attitude all of my life since high school because that's how I respond. That's how I'm used to responding. I also decided that my evaluation of others was a little harsh. I don't think it's so much that people don't give a damn. What I think is that we ask that question so often and we get so many answers that if you actually emotionally responded to every answer you got, you'd be crazy by the end of the day. You wouldn't know how to react because you hear so many stories and usually people respond with negative stories because that's what they're thinking about. And so I think we turn it off just as a protection mechanism. I no longer blame people for not actually listening or not listening with any kind of detail. So, but I really don't think we listen to the responses to that. So I find that I get a much better response from people when I say spectacular than if I start complaining about the parking ticket I got yesterday or how my big toe hurts or whatever.
This is again going a little backward, and I apologize about the lack of order in these questions.
That's okay. You'll cut this up and move it around.
Yeah. When did you meet your wife? What's her name, and when did you meet her?
Her name is Barbara Pilo, and I met her in Rochester, New York. Interestingly, we both went to school in Rochester. I went to RIT. She went to the University of Rochester. My senior year was her freshman year. Her senior year, I taught at RIT. Never met then. A number of years later, we were both in Rochester on business trips and staying at the same hotel. And I'd gone down to the dining room and had ordered dinner. And with a passion, I hate eating alone. And I really hate eating dinner alone. And right after I ordered, I see this woman walk in with a book. She sits down. The other places are cleared at the table. And I just walked over and asked her if she wanted to join me for dinner. And we sat down and had dinner, found out that our offices were a block and a half back in Manhattan. And when we got back to Manhattan, started seeing one another. Of course, it still annoys my wife that she knows that was neither the first and the last time I did that. But she is the only person I saw after one of those dinners.
And how old are your children?
This month they will be 28 and 31.
In the same month. That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything to say?
Interestingly, we've always given them the choice of having separate birthday parties or having them together. They have never chosen to have them together.
And what do they do? What do your children do now? What are their occupations?
My son works for Fidelity Investments. He's I'm trying to remember what his title is. He's basically a financial advisor for people who trade options, where he can't make buying decisions for them, but he helps them figure out their strategies on what they're going to be doing. My daughter lives in New York, works in White Plains, and she's with a wealth management firm. And so she's, in a lot of respects, she's doing something somewhat similar, but she's helping people with their financial management plans for how they're going to handle their money for the rest of their lives.
Well, thank you so much for coming in today. We really appreciate it. And we can't thank you enough.
Oh, it was easy. Although I should mention that I've ended up doing a lot of things in Scouting, and two of the committees I'm on are the Dallas Jewish Committee on Scouting and the National Jewish Committee on Scouting.
Now I have to ask you another question. I want to know more about this. So
Okay.
Can you please expand on those, please, and just tell me what you do for them and what their mission is in the community?
Well, there are 12 points to the Scout Law, and one of them is reverence. And Scouting supports religion very strongly, but doesn't support any specific religion. It's up to people to believe whatever they want. Most of the religions have basically committees within Scouting to support them. So there's a Jewish committee on Scouting, a Catholic, Islamic, I mean, you name it. At the last Jamboree, I was working on the Faith and Beliefs Committee, and there was a pavilion with representation from 28 different religious committees. 28. There were a lot of us. And it was great because everybody was getting along, and kids were coming by asking interesting questions. The job of the committees, whether the local committee or the national committee, is to help integrate both Scouting with Judaism and Judaism with Scouting. So there are some activities we typically do every year that either local or national will sponsor. Like locally, we do a Scout Shabbat every year. That's the Shabbat after the annual anniversary of Scouting. The anniversary of Scouting in the U.S. is February 8th. So it would be, well, this coming year will be February 9th. We typically do religious emblem workshops. For each religion, you can fulfill requirements to earn an emblem, And there are different emblems for different age groups. There's an Aleph, a Maccabee, Ner Talmid, and an Es Chaim for young, a little bit older, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, older Boy Scouts. And so we run workshops to help the kids qualify for those. Nationally, there are camps that are run. Some of the local Jewish committees run kinnuses, which are basically weekend campouts that are religious based. Every 4 years when there's a national jamboree, there's at least one and sometimes several Shomer Shabbat troops that are put together so that they can live together and do everything to follow the laws of kashrut. One of the things we do locally is each year on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, we work with the Jewish war veterans to put new flags on the graves of Jewish veterans. If you go to our Facebook page, the Dallas Jewish Committee on Scouting Facebook page, you'll see photos from several years of when we've done that. And we're always looking for new things. One of the things we tried to get done this year that never happened, but we're going to try to do next year, is we were putting together Scouting for Cub Scouts runs pine wood derbies, where they have these little blocks of pine wood and they build race cars out of them and then race them. And we were wanted to put one together that was the Jewish Committee on Scouting and the Islamic Committee all bringing Jewish and Islamic Scouts together for a pine wood derby.
Great.
Yeah, and we end up doing a lot of things with the Islamic Committee. Nationally, there's some really good people in that committee. I have a series of T-shirts that say the Islamic Committee on Scouting.
I knew there was one question I was missing. I'm like, this is what I was the one question. Thank you so much for telling me about that. We really appreciate all you do, and thank you again for coming to see us today.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.